got a Bible, open up to the book of Galatians. We're going to start today, and we're going to spend the next, I don't know how long it's going to take us to go through Galatians, but we're going to be in the book of Galatians probably for quite a while. At times we're going to jump out, we'll hit other things along the way, hit some other sections, some other parts of the Bible at times. But we're going to start just working our way through the book of Galatians. And I've read this letter from Paul many times. And probably you have read this letter that we call the book of Galatians. And really, it is a letter. It was a letter that Paul wrote to the churches of Galatia. As you read all of the letters of Paul, in many ways to me, the book of Galatians kind of stands out. There's something a little different about it than some of the others. I will tell you, the letter to the Galatians, it's not the longest. It's not the most theological. It doesn't give the most outstanding teaching, but it stands out for something. And in a lot of ways, what it stands out to me is the passion that Paul pours into that letter. And as you read the book of Galatians, that passion that he has for what he's writing is just spilling off. And I mean, you can just read it. It's like it just comes off of the pages to you as you read the book. And as you read this letter, Paul's concern for the people that he's writing to, it just comes alive. You can tell that his heart is tore up. That what is going on in the churches in Galatia, it's just killing Paul. It's bugging him, man. It is bothering him so bad. And you can tell that he wants to write so much more, but it's like, man, if I write all of these things to you, and I tell you everything I'd really like to tell you, and I tell the guys that are causing you problems everything I'd really like to tell them, well, we would all get in trouble. And it definitely would not fit into a G-rated book or even maybe a PG-rated book. Because there's a lot of things that he would, I think, would like to tell the churches in Galatia and the leaders, the teachers that were leading them astray. There's a lot of things that he'd like to tell them that, well, you couldn't put into a family-friendly publication. We're going to look at this letter. And as we get started into the letter, I want to take a few minutes to kind of look at what we would call the introductory matters. And then we're going to end the message today with a focus on the idea that it's all about God. Well, as we kind of look at the introductory matters, first thing you want to ask is, who is the author? The author is the Apostle Paul. He is universally accepted as the author of this book. And as you look at Paul, there's some things that really kind of stand out, especially in relation to the book Galatians, this letter to these churches in Galatia. There's some things about Paul that I think we have to kind of grasp because it does factor into what we read and what we study when we look at the book of Galatians. Number one is Paul was shaped by his Hebrew upbringing. In the book, he calls himself a Hebrew of Hebrews. As Paul studied in Jerusalem under a man named Gamaliel. And under Gamaliel, he was a prized student. Now you may go, so what? Who is this Gamaliel guy? Well, Gamaliel was a renowned scholar, a renowned rabbi in the nation of Israel. He is actually quoted in the book of Acts in our New Testament. And Gamaliel was one who was widely respected. Respected enough that he was actually on the Sanhedrin, which was the ruling council for the city of Jerusalem and even for the nation. So Paul was like the top student of the top religious scholar in the nation of Israel. Paul was on his way to becoming the man in Israel. I mean, he was on his way to becoming the top religious authority outside of the high priest. But the top religious authority, the acknowledged authority, the one that everybody looked to, if you had a question about some Bible verse, it would have been Paul. Paul was on his way to becoming that person. In the book of Galatians, he defends against these teachings regarding Jesus that they were called Judaizers. Men from James. You read them, they call them different things throughout the book and in other places. But they were men who were coming to the churches of Galatia. And they were telling the churches in Galatia that you had to be also a Jew. You had to accept Judaism and accept all of the trappings of Judaism. Paul defends against that. But during his time, before he became a Christian, before he was converted on the road to Damascus, Paul defended Judaism against the teachings regarding Jesus. Paul was on his way to Damascus to find the new followers of Christ and to persecute them, to bring them and to arrest them, and to do all kinds of terrible things to them. Paul was zealous in his defense of Judaism until that amazing day on the road to Damascus. Now Paul has gone from defending Judaism against the teachings of Jesus. Now he is defending Christ and the teachings of Christ against the incoming of Judaism and bringing that into and making that to be a part of what it means to be a follower of Christ. They were trying to add Jewish law and rituals to faith in Christ. And now Paul is saying, no, you can't do that. And he does that throughout the book. So what does it matter that Paul was one who defended Judaism and now is defending Christianity? Well, how does that factor into the book? Doesn't it make it interesting that Paul is the one, Paul has a platform as a faithful Jew to stand against those teachings. Because he could stand and say, listen, there is nobody who was more Jewish than me. I am a Hebrew of Hebrews, a Pharisee of Pharisees. The Pharisees, they were the strict religious people. Paul could say, among those strict religious people called the Pharisees would look at me and say, you are a Pharisee. They would say, man, Paul, you are one, you make us Pharisees look like a bunch of liberals. You make us Pharisees look like a bunch of people that have no religion. You are so devout in your religion. Paul could stand and say, I was the strictest. I was the most devout Jew. And nobody progressed faster and further in Judaism than Paul did. But on the other side, Paul understood Hellenistic culture. He understood the Greco-Roman culture. He had grown up most of his formative years in the city of Tarsus. Tarsus was a Roman colony, and actually Paul was a Roman citizen because his dad had been a Roman citizen. And so Paul, even though he was a Jew, Paul understood completely and implicitly the Greek and Roman culture. And therefore, as he writes to people and he traveled around, Paul was able to understand what people were thinking. And you see many times in Paul's writings and his teachings how he quotes philosophers and poets among the Romans and the Greeks. And it shows us that Paul really had this understanding. And so Paul knew the Hebrew culture, he knew the Jewish culture, he knew the Greco-Roman culture, and he was able to bring these things together in his teaching. And so no matter which side he's standing on, Paul is able to bridge that gap between the two groups. So who was this letter written to? Well, I will tell you there is a lot of argument over how to define the term Galatia. In many ways, it's not all that interesting, but if you're interested in it, I've got commentaries I can give you, and there are pages after pages after pages. They're arguing. It really comes down to, do you define the term Galatia according to political geography or according to ethnic geography? In Paul's time, the region called Galatia encompassed an entire Roman province. And that province of Galatia was much larger than the traditional territory of the ethnic Gauls. Now, when you hear the term Gaul, you probably think maybe of France. This is not France that we're talking about. It is actually the same people, but it was a group of the Gauls that went out and went into France and gave that term to that area. But this is a wholly different area, but it is kind of the same people. They were warlike people. They were very fierce. They were also very fickle. And you see that sometimes in the book of Galatians, some of the things that Paul writes to them. They were known for being kind of changing sides and not being people that, they got on one thing and they were on that. So he writes, so you have these two different ideas. Which one is it? There's good arguments on both sides. In the end, it really only impacts when you set the date of the writing of the letter. After studying this issue, and I read all of those commentaries, I've studied it before this and went back and read them again, I came back to the same conclusion. I believe that this letter was written early in Paul's ministry, making this probably one of the first of the books of the New Testament that we have. One of the reasons that I come down to that, Paul deals with an issue that was settled at the Jerusalem conference that is described in the book of Acts chapter 15. If this letter was late in Paul's ministry, and the question that he's talking about was answered fully at the Jerusalem conference, then why doesn't Paul just go in and when he writes a letter, instead of spending a lot of time arguing for his case, why didn't he just say, hey guys, the Jerusalem conference settled it? He doesn't. And so as I look at that, I kind of thought, okay, that means that this is an early book. It's an early letter that we have. What was the problem? This is the most crucial aspect that we have to grasp. Paul was concerned that the churches were being led astray by false teachers who were trying to impose Jewish law on the Christian believers. In essence, the teachers said that Jesus was important. And they wouldn't go so far as to deny Jesus. They emphasized the death of Christ, the resurrection of Christ. They would believe all those things. But really, if you boil down all of their teachings, it sounds as if what they would say is, yes, Jesus is important, but only as an addition to the law. To really be part of God's people, one had to become Jewish. In order to really join the family of God, you had to become Jewish. And in becoming Jewish, you had to accept all of the trappings of the Jewish faith. Paul argues that adding anything to Christ negated all of Christ's work on our behalf. Paul says if you add any requirements, then you have negated everything. And so Paul says, no, you cannot add the Jewish law. You can't say that for a person to be part of the God's family that they have to be circumcised. Because by doing that, by circumcising a child and saying we have to circumcise this person so that they can be part and become part of the family of God, and what you're saying is not just circumcision, but you're adding all of the other aspects of the Jewish law to that. And Paul says, no, you cannot. As we examine the book, it becomes obvious, and you don't even have to really examine the book. We know who won the debate. We know who won the argument. But at the same time, I think we fight some of the same battles that Paul was fighting. And yet, though there is nobody going to be teaching you, trying to say to you, that we have to add the Jewish dietary laws. Now, it's been a long time. I don't think I have ever heard a Christian preacher stand up and say, we have to observe the Jewish dietary laws. I think that's because we like eating ham too much. But you're not going to hear that. Nobody is going to say we have to add the Jewish dietary laws. But at the same time, we always have this tendency that we have to fight of adding things to the message of Christ. We have the same battles. And so is this book still important? Absolutely. Absolutely.